Hi, I'm Kiwi, and I am a failed history teacher. And if you see the original intro to this video, you'll understand why. Outnumbered 15 to 1 in the last battle of the Abbasid Revolution. As fear fell over the eyes of his men, his heart hardened and he ordered. Okay, enough of that. God. After half a year of debilitating anxiety, being lost without any place in the world, and having that weird feeling where you're being crushed by the weight of all of your life's mistakes, I have decided that I haven't suffered enough. So, today, I'm going to be talking about one of the bloodiest, nastiest, horriblestness, and worst nights in human history, the Banquet of Blood. You might be here because you are a college student in a medieval Islamic history class and you haven't been attending lecture all semester long. You also might be planning a Halloween semi-formal for your totally unacademic fraternity. If you're anything like me, you're probably just some boring teacher or professor who can't keep their students awake unless you have the internet teach them for you. Or you are a jury falling asleep during my war crimes trial in The Hague, in which case, I definitely did it. Either way, you're gonna watch me, or more likely, listen to me while doing something else infinitely more interesting. Rant for 30-ish minutes about some psychopath from 1,000 years ago who had all of his political enemies beaten to death with clubs over dinner. Intro! There was somehow a way to put the camera in the middle of the screen so I'm not constantly going. We're gonna be chill now. I'm done with the dramatic stuff. So now it is 750 CE, and after a decade of plotting, scheming, and fighting battles, the Abbasid Revolution has finally succeeded. The Abbasid Revolution is one of the most complex and intricate eras in human history, and I am not going to do it justice in the 2 minutes that I have to explain this part of the video. So what I'm going to do is tell you the basics, and more importantly, I'm going to tell you to check out another YouTuber by the name Muqaddimah, which I'm very sorry, I probably butchered that pronunciation. Please forgive me. But go check out Muqaddimah's video on the Abbasid Revolution as part of his series on the Abbasid Caliphate. He does a fantastic job outlining why they went to war, what were the major factors, and what were the major themes of this war. But today, I want to hone in on a very specific event that always gets covered in intro to Middle East or ancient Middle East history classes that everyone wants to learn more about, and I want to really dive into it. So what you need to know about the Abbasids before we dive into the Banquet of Blood is basically the Abbasids are a new coming family claiming to have a lineage to the Prophet Muhammad in order to take over the caliphate. They have overturned the predominantly Arab Umayyad social class system and overturned the Umayyad dynasty, sending them packing. But the Umayyads still have loyalists, specifically in their power base in Syria and Palestine. The Abbasids are in control of an empire that spans all the way from Tunisia in the North African coast, all the way through the Indus River, the border with India. This empire controls the entire Middle East, almost all of North Africa, and a bunch more stuff. This is a huge empire that decides the fates of millions and millions of people on the planet at the time. So whatever happens, however this empire turns out in the first few years, shapes world history. We are going to pick up with our main anti-protagonist, what is that? There's a word for evil protagonist, and I don't remember it right now. If I find it, it's going to be here somewhere. But we pick up with Abdallah, the evil guy that we've been following, as he becomes the governor of Syria under the new Abbasid state. So, blah, blah, blah. Abdallah captures Damascus, brother gets Marwan, skirmishes, assassinations, can't get access. Perfect, that's easy. Easy enough. Any good plot needs a starting place, a reason to start plotting, a treasure chest full of gold, one might say, that needs to be stolen. Here, Abdallah wants money. It always comes down to money in history. That's the lesson for today. What's important is that Abdallah is now put in charge by his nephew, the Caliph, of all of Syria. So as governor of Syria, he has a big problem. This land, Syria and Palestine, was unevenly colonized by the Arabs. That means that there are pockets of Arab communities in different places, pockets of Syrian communities in different places, and this creates a lot of political and ethnic tensions. Syria and Palestine is a melting pot of different ethnicities, different languages, and different political alliances. And so even though the Abbasids control everything and they have the army and the power of the state, not everyone's on board, because not everyone's ever on board with the current people in charge. What makes this specifically thorny for Abdallah and the Caliph al-Safa is the fact that many Umayyad nobles still hold out in different caves and different strongholds throughout Syria and Palestine. This land is heavily mountainous. It also has a bunch of fertile land, good cropland, very wealthy land that the Umayyads had owned. What this means is that the Umayyads are still rich and have control over a bunch of land and people that Abdallah is not getting. And he won the war, he should get the riches, at least that's what he thinks. So he needs to take that from them. This is going to be horrible. You have to be okay with that. Hope you guys are okay with that too. Okay, so we are getting to the actual build-up of this evil plan that Abdallah has come up with. Since he is the uncle to the Caliph, he's able to call up his nephew, or more accurately put, write up his nephew, and ask for what are called writs of safe passage. These are special contracts that were used at the time in order to negotiate a safe passage, obviously, of someone who is otherwise definitely going to be killed. So, for example, you overthrow somebody, or they overthrow you, and they want you dead, or you want them dead. Somebody wants someone dead. This is how it goes in the medieval times. What you do is you send a pigeon, or a letter, or a whoever to write out and to deliver it and say, hey, I'm going to write, on a piece of paper that on my eternal soul, I'm not going to kill you. Let's come to the negotiating table. So Abdallah gets the Caliph al-Safa to write a bunch of these writs of safe passage for the surviving Umayyad nobles. These would grant the Umayyad nobles basically a pardon as long as they accept Abbasid authority. It's very important to get the language of these writs of safe passage very specifically correct. Abdallah, or more accurately put, probably one of his scribes, understood the importance of how these loopholes and the specific legal contracts and how the languages all work together. And it's impossible to know what exactly were in these documents. It could have been blank. It wasn't that, but it could have been. It could have had a bunch of logic gaps. It could have been very specific. All that we know is that he sent these writs of safe passage out to these Umayyad nobles, and they believe that he was serious about negotiating a amicable peace. In a highly sensitive situation like this, it's also very common for both sides to send letters back and forth. So before you go anywhere, you're not going to leave the safety of your home before you are absolutely sure there's no loopholes and the other guy's not doing any funny business. In this case, it seems that something weird happened with all of these writs of safe passage. These writs would have guaranteed that if Abdallah had done anything funny, say, have a bunch of partisans murder them with clubs in a banquet, that would have not been okay if these were properly signed, negotiated, and carried out. So we don't, as historians today, have any copies of these specific writs of safe passage from specifically the Banquet of Blood, which makes a lot of sense because if I was planning to murder a bunch of people and I made a fake legal document to entice them to come to my house to get murdered, I probably wouldn't keep copies of that lying around for people to read 1,000 years later, but that's just me. What we do know is that the Umayyads took Abdallah up on this offer. And I can already hear you, but Mr. Kiwinda, why would they do that? That sounds like crazy, and wasn't this obviously a trap? Yes. Yes, young, dumb me in a classroom. It was obviously a trap. Yeah, it is not very subtle how much of a trap this is, so what gives? Basically, this can probably be explained through a variety of factors, mostly circling around the fact that these individual Umayyad nobles, because of how segmented and separated the geography is, cannot really communicate with each other. They might think that they are the only survivor of the revolution. They might think that only a couple Umayyads have survived, and they certainly don't have an army to overthrow the Abbasids at this point, who control the entire empire. So they are really, really out of options. Their only option is to just hold out in a cave or in their strongholds on a farm and hope that the Abbasids don't get around to killing them in the next couple months. And another thing is the consequences for violating one of these writs of safe passage can be, depending on the wording, can be huge. If you violate one of these writs of safe passage, and you could be completely excommunicated from the entire Muslim community. And what this practically means is that anyone, everyone, every single Muslim that has ever existed and is currently alive and has a stick to hit you with not only can, but has a duty to find you, kill you, take all of your stuff, kill your entire family and your family line, and do all of the horribleness to you. And you are like, this isn't just you're going to hell. This is life is a living hell. You get tortured to death, and now you go to hell. Like the consequences in the cultural psyche of the Muslim community at this time of violating one of these contracts outright are huge, especially for someone with so much power as Abdallah, and everyone wants it. Everyone's willing to raise an army and to kill him, and none of his allies can support him if he breaks a contract like this. So that's why it is especially weird that he sends out these writs of safe passage to all of these Umayyad nobles, who are still Muslims, despite the fact that everyone hates them, and organizes a murder fest for when they arrive, which makes me think, personally, that something was going on inside the language of the contract that allowed him to get away with this. Or the only copies that he sent were with the Umayyad nobles and him, and they were all destroyed. Because as we're going to get to, a lot of people died even outside of the Banquet of Blood. It was a lot of blood. It was a banquet of blood for a reason. There was a lot of blood. Also, they were very confused. The Umayyads had not really much in the way of communication ever since the last battle. And so over time, over the months that the Abbasids are cracking down on the Umayyads, they're cutting off supply lines, they're cutting off postal lines, communication lines, any spine networks that the Umayyads have. And so slowly by slowly, they are becoming more and more disoriented in a world where they don't know what's going on. So as all of these writs of safe passage are going out to all the Umayyad nobles, basically promising, hey, come to my house. I know that we're mortal enemies, but I promise, pinky swear, I'm not gonna kill you. I like you. You're not gonna die. I totally promise. As all of that's happening, Abdallah, is making the actual preparations for the night in question. He gets a bunch of Abbasid partisans around and has them plan to prepare a surprise for the Umayyad guests at the banquet. And this is another good chance to talk about one of the other cool things about the Abbasids. And by cool, I mean horrible and terrible. But basically, here, this is wild. You know how the CIA is the CIA? Yeah, the Abbasids had basically had their own CIA of postal workers even before they took over the caliphate. They had an incredibly sophisticated intelligence apparatus that could get information from across the and by across the empire, I'm not talking, oh, we're going from Chicago to St. Louis on horseback. No, that's small potatoes. That's easy. This intelligence apparatus could get information all the way from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula all the way up to Baghdad in modern-day Iraq in a matter of days. They had checkpoints where if an imperial messenger was going by, they could ride up to the checkpoint and get a new horse and keep riding through the night. They had a system of handing letters and information off from person to person across the land, and they could cover some crazy distances, like insane distances. When Abdallah goes to his Abbasid spies and says, I need you to find the locations and everything about every single Umayyad noble, we can infer that is going to get done. And so one of the big problems in identifying, like, how were the Abbasids able to completely obliterate all of the Umayyads nobles all in one night? It's because of how relentless Abdallah is as a person and how relentless the network of spies that he's using are in enforcing Abbasid rule. Okay, so we've set up a lot of different things. How the spies are going out locating the Umayyad nobles. How the Umayyad nobles might have actually wanted to use this as an opportunity to negotiate their freedom. And we've talked about all of Abdallah's motivations as well. But remember how I said this is obviously a trap? Yeah, it was still obviously a trap. And there was one Umayyad noble who was able to identify this as a trap. And so when he got this invitation to go to this banquet by the guy who had just murdered the entire leadership and overthrown the entire leadership of his empire, he said, nah, I don't think so. And he went into hiding. And we'll come back to him later. In the days before the banquet, nobles would have been trickling in to Abu Futuris. Some would have been staying for a while. Some may have arrived on the day of the banquet. But all told, when the banquet started, 80 Umayyad nobles were in attendance. Abu Futuris was a very small and quiet town outside of the big cities and away from the common rabble. It's a perfect place to have a fancy banquet with a bunch of nobles and wealthy people because They're not going to be disturbed when they're having their food by loud noises. They are also not going to be overheard when they're negotiating about the future of the realm. It's a perfect place to get away from everything and celebrate the end of hostilities of the Abbasid Revolution. Incidentally, it's also a perfect place to plan a mass murder because no one's around to catch you. So, one of the biggest and most important thing in medieval Islamic culture, especially in the upper crust, is tact and niceties, especially at these banquets. Traditions would have been of paramount importance. So they would have started before the meal discussing and talking. And since there were nobles from all across Syria and Palestine in all likelihood, the Umayyads probably didn't feel like anything was especially amiss at first. So the meal would have been started, and everyone would have cleaned and washed their hands before they entered the dining area, and then they would have been seated. And there probably would have been incense at the table to help improve the overall smell, and everyone would have been wearing very clean clothes, very fancy clothes, and been wearing fancy perfumes because cleanliness is a huge cultural thing around these banquets, especially for people in the upper crust. During this time, before the meal actually got started, slaves and servants would have been waiting on guests diligently, making sure that the clean environment is kept as best as possible. And because the traditions of the prophets' hadiths, the sayings of the prophets, were very important, anything that deviated from normal banquet etiquette, especially for the Abbasid nobles who are very used to being in charge and following these rules of nobility to the T, any difference would have set them off or tipped them off that something was very wrong. So it's almost a certainty that Abdallah made sure that everything was perfectly right so that the Umayyads wouldn't get tipped off before it was too late. And another part of this would have meant that everyone, including those who would not have been surviving the night, the Umayyads, would have been given a plate and would have had food served to them at their table. By all accounts, Abdallah was the highest ranking person at this specific banquet. So he, in all likelihood, would have eaten first after giving the prayer, praising God for this meal and the opportunity to eliminate his enemies. That last part was probably silent. He probably didn't say that out loud. As everyone sits down at their tables in the banquet hall for their main course, figures are lurking in the background. Of course, most of these figures are servants, slaves, wait staff who are taking care of the guests. Some may have also been pulling double duty as assassins, but of course the Umayyads aren't thinking about that right now. It isn't exactly clear at what point during the banquet Abdallah gives the signal to start the blood part of the Banquet of Blood, but Abdallah gives the signal for dozens of Abbasid partisans to leap into view with clubs. They grab the Umayyads from their meal and beat them mercilessly as the other nobles sit by and watch. Abdallah remains seated at the head of the table, calmly continuing his meal as the bloody scene unfolds. The horrid screaming and the gory scene would be incomprehensibly unbearable to all present except for the most battle-hardened and sociopathic. Cleanliness is the biggest thing. And so anyone who is among the battle-hardened and the sociopaths would probably have been very keen to avoid any blood or guts or brain matter on their clothes, their hands, or worst case scenario, God forbid, on their food. So it is even possible that some of these nobles would have told the assassins to get away and to beat the victims away from the table. However, the vast majority of the surviving nobles, the nobles who weren't the Umayyads, were probably just in shock at the scene. So why didn't they do anything, right? That's a question that is of that sticks in my mind. How can you sit there and watch as people that you know, people that you have been to banquets before, and people who rule and are in your social network are being brutally, horribly, unimaginably, bloodily beaten to death right next to you? For the most part, it was probably just the fear of being killed next. They're watching people getting ambushed and beaten to death horribly, and most human beings would be in shock at a scene like this. For the ones that wasn't enough of an explanation, they probably wanted to profit off of the Umayyads' deaths. Remember, the Umayyads control a lot of land in Syria and Palestine, and as long as the Umayyad royal family exists, that land is going to be tied up as their own possessions. So many of these nobles who wanted to expand their power and expand their reach were probably just holding out, hoping that they could benefit from this whole bloody affair. Many also probably had old feuds. This nobility we're talking about, families. They love to hate each other. They love to get into petty old fights. And this would have been a very great chance to settle some blood feuds, right? And another factor that could have contributed to other nobles just sitting by is the history of oppression at the hands of the Arab nobility since the original Muslim conquests about a century or more earlier. During the height of the Umayyad Empire, remember, they were an Arab first empire. Even if other people were Muslim, the Arab Muslims were at the top of society and everyone else was below, and there was a ceiling to how high you could go up. And that's why many people supported the Abbasid Revolution in the first place. So it would have also benefited many of these nobles who may have been Syrian or Palestinian or Greek Christians or of different races and ethnicities. It might have benefited them to have the last of the Umayyads gone for good. And for many, it was probably just as simple as the political winds are changing and you want to be on the winning side. No one wants to be siding with the losers, especially when the losers are getting their heads caved in by a bunch of angry people with bats. I would prefer to be on the winning side of that, honestly. When we're talking about history, it's impossible to know for sure what any of the specific motivations of any of the specific people there would have been. We can't read their minds, and the vast majority of them, and all the people, as far as I can tell, from this specific event, did not write down their thoughts and how they processed this event. And if they did, they probably would have been hunted down because there's no way Abdallah would let a description of an event like this get out into the general public or be recorded by historians of his time. So we are kind of just putting things together, kind of like detectives, thinking about the different contexts, where people are coming from, putting ourselves in their shoes, and trying to understand and brainstorm what their motives would be. For many of the people, the nobles who survived the Banquet of Blood, who weren't the Umayyads, they were probably thinking a mixture of all of these different factors, and it was just easier to not do anything. As the sounds of the massacre died down, the murderers would have been hasty to clean up the mess so that the remaining nobles could finish their meal. Servants, probably as in shock as everyone else, because again, you can't tell everyone, hey, I'm about to murder all of these people today, here's the time, be ready to clean up some blood, haha, lol. No, you can't do that. So these servants and these slaves are probably as in shock and horror as anyone else would be. But they would have been forced on the spot to help the murderers clean up all of the bodies and clean up all of the blood on the scene. Unwilling to wait for the victims to be disposed of outside the banquet hall, Abdallah ordered the staff to lay the bodies and the survivors in the center of the room in a big flat pile, cover them with a heavy rug that he prepared for the occasion, and place the dinner tables back on top. Depending on the kind of statement Abdallah wished to make, he may have had water brought back out for the remaining alive guests to wash themselves in their eating area so that they weren't literally eating next to brain tissue and blood. But he also, knowing Abdallah and how cruel he was, he may have refused them this basic courtesy, knowing that this would make the kind of statement that, like, hey, you see all of this nastiness that you're eating around right next to? That's you're gonna be next if you are messing with the Abbasids and our power. We are in charge now. Whatever the case, the meal commenced, and now on unstable tables, and the silence was only broken by the dying moans of the last of the Umayyad royal family. Many of the Umayyads did not take the bait, assuming that, of course, Abdallah has something up his sleeves. Why would you go right into his trap? But since all of the other Umayyad nobles were now dead, the remaining few were a lot easier to target and get. And so Abdallah, at the same time as this bloody banquet, had his soldiers ride out all across Syria and Palestine to the remaining strongholds of the Umayyad nobles and hunt them down and execute them. They were likely able to launch many surprise attacks and overwhelm the Umayyads' personal guards because they weren't stretched as thin across as many noble strongholds. And since most of the nobles took Abdallah's banquet invite, there was likely no one to come to the aid of the ones that were left. Mobs stormed Umayyad tombs and looted their graves, desecrating remains. Almost no Umayyad remains were spared the torch. All of the Umayyad land holdings, almost overnight, were seized by Abdallah's men, and he divided up the spoils between himself and his brother rather than giving them to the Abbasid government. When the dust settled, the sun rose, and the bodies were all successfully rotting where they lay, one Umayyad noble remained, Rahman. He and his family, some of his family, were successfully able to escape the Abbasid cavalry long enough to get out into Egypt and North Africa, and eventually he found his way to Spain, which had been recently conquered by different Muslim warlords under the Umayyad Empire. They loved him there, and it's a very, very long story, but in short, he was able to found his own second Umayyad dynasty that ruled over Spain, then called Al-Andalus, for the next over 300 years. And Muslims controlled Spain after the Umayyad dynasty fell until 1492. Same year, in fact, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So that's over 700 years of Muslim-controlled Spain, which is something that when I learned about it, I had my mind blown. Rahman's story also deserves his own video, so make sure that you like and subscribe, because I would love to tell his story, because he also wrote so much of it down. I could go on. But heading back to the 750s, Al-Safa died 4 years after the Banquet of Blood in 754. And of course, Abdallah, being Banquet of Blood, murder my enemies and my friends, Abdallah contested the throne and fought his other nephew, who was second in line for the throne, in order to take control of the caliphate. This is also another incredibly complicated and interesting and weird time, but basically, Abdallah fails. Abu Ja'far, his other nephew, ends up on the throne and imprisons Abdallah. Very long story short, Abu Ja'far wins and imprisons Abdallah and his brother in a house that was purposefully designed to fall on their head and has them assassinated, allegedly. I don't want to slander a guy who's been dead for over 1,000 years, because just in case, and maybe, I don't know, maybe Abu Ja'far has some lawyers and you never know. Well, now that I think about it, Abu Ja'far probably wouldn't have been sending lawyers as much as he would have been sending goons on horseback with scimitars to chop my head off. So, yeah. What's important when all of this craziness is settled is that Abu Ja'far took the name Al-Mansur and solidified Abbasid rule over the caliphate, founded the new capital of Baghdad, and put the empire on track to be the global center of commerce, science, and culture for the next several centuries. It's actually kind of hard to decide who the winners and the losers of this whole Banquet of Blood affair are. Of course, the Umayyads kind of lost real hard because almost all of them got completely massacred. But Rahman still survived, and without the Banquet of Blood, he never would have found himself in Spain, uniting all of the Muslim nobles of Spain together and founding an empire that lasted for over 300 years. It's easy to say that Abdallah won because he's the one who murdered all of these people, and he became governor and successfully solidified Abbasid power. But in the end, he was still not able to achieve his final aim, which was take control of the whole caliphate with his new army and wealth. And he died in a building falling on his head, which is kind of poetic in a way. And it's also really hard to assign who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. It's easy to feel bad for the Umayyads because they were the ones who kind of got murdered horribly, but you have to remember that the reason this whole Abbasid Revolution happened was because the Umayyads had set up a system where the Arab ethnic minority was the exclusive power holders across a vast empire that spanned from, North Africa all the way through modern-day Iran and up until the Indus River. They had colonized many of these populations, and even when locals converted to Islam to rise up through the ranks, they were still treated as second-class citizens in their own lands. So the Umayyads aren't really saints either. And it's not to say the Umayyads deserve to be horribly and brutally murdered just for access to their land, but it paints this picture of a complicated and messy game. I don't know what should I call it? It's like a game of like chairs. I don't know, Monopoly of Thrones. So someone in the comments tell me what this is a lot like. But when you think about the Banquet of Blood, it really reminds me of the Red Wedding, where there are people that we find various levels of attachment to, characters who are more sympathetic and less sympathetic, but in the end, everyone is fighting for power. And if there is one lesson to be taken out of this complete, messy, bloody disaster, it's that there's no saints among sinners, and when you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. Thanks for watching. And make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you get notified when more of my videos come out. And also comment below, what do you think about the Banquet of Blood? Do you sympathize more with the Umayyads or the Abbasids, or neither? Also, comment below what other parts of history you think that I should be covering next. I'm really trying to focus on smaller stories that don't really get covered by other channels. So I'm probably not going to do like the Napoleonic Wars, because you have Oversimplified did an excellent video on that. I'm probably not going to cover major figures in history, because there are a lot of amazing videos that already cover those. But I want to dive into specific stories from time periods that we, especially in English language YouTube, don't talk about a whole lot. So comment below, like I said, what do you want to see next? Also, I'd like to give a major shout out to Muqaddimah. Check out his YouTube channel right here. He has an amazing collection of well-researched, comprehensive, and understandable videos on all different parts of medieval Islamic history. I could not have made this video without his research as a foundation. And another source that I really want to shout out in the video is worldhistory.org and medievalist.net. Both of them have excellent articles on the Abbasid Revolution, the details on the Banquet of Blood, and a lot of resources to get started into researching this area on your own. Without all of these different amazing sources, I would not have been able to make this video and piece together this history and describe it in this level of detail. Of course, my full works cited is linked to in the video description, so go check that out if you're a student and you're looking to include any of the sources that I've cited in a paper, or you want to just learn more about the Banquet of Blood, the Abbasid Revolution, because it's an incredibly interesting part of our shared human history. I'm Kiwi, and remember, people change, humans don't. See you next time.